Hey guys, Pete here. This is going to be my 10 Things You Might Have Missed video for Twin Peaks The Return Part 17, which was the first half of the season finale of Season 3. Spoiler warning, if you're not caught up to the end of The Return through the finale, you're not going to want to watch this video because it's certainly going to mess things up and ruin all of it for you. So go ahead and watch something else and come back when you finish the series. So a lot of interesting stuff happened in Part 17, and I think this was pretty universally enjoyed, whereas 18 was a little more divisive as far as whether people liked it or were frustrated by it. So we're going to do this just like we've done all the 10 Things videos, and I'll do a separate one for Part 18 tomorrow. The first thing you might have missed was the sound that we heard when Laura disappears as Cooper is leading her to the portal is actually the giant sound. I say it's the giant sound because it's the one we heard on the record player whenever he's talking to Coop in the scene where, he tells them Richard and Linda, 4:30, two birds with one stone. What exactly it means that this is that sound isn't clear, but it's interesting to note since the only other time we've heard it was at that scene where we heard Coop listen to it through the gramophone. We've certainly heard a lot of background noises. We've heard the one that they hear in the Great Northern, and then the one we hear most of the time that, the creepy electrical noises are the ones that we've come to associate with the dark forces in our story. Why I say that what it actually means isn't clear, because I think it's probably pretty complicated. One, they're walking towards the fireman's portal, so that was the intended outcome, that she would get taken to his lair, or what we consider to most likely be the White Lodge. But two, the screaming that happens right after the disappearance seems to imply that something went wrong with that plan. And since we saw Sarah Palmer's character smashing Laura's homecoming picture just before that, it seems that those two things were connected to Judy. Speaking of Sarah, that brings us to the next thing you might have missed. In that scene, there's quite a few interesting things that could slip by you on the first watch. First, the orientation of this scene in the timeline is confusing. If we look at these three scenes in a straight line, how they're presented, we see a flashback to Josie and Pete's morning in a reality where Laura doesn't wash up on the shore wrapped in plastic. A timeline where she never dies. Then we see Sarah take the photo and start to smash it with the bottle. Then the scene with Cooper leading Laura through the woods happens. So that could be an indication that all three of those things are happening concurrently, but not necessarily in the same reality or the same dimension or the same timeline. Anyways, the first thing you might have missed here is that the photo and Sarah are in the Season 3 timeline. In other words, this is the house that we've seen her sitting around in the timeline where Laura and Leland died. When Laura disappears in the next scene, the existence of that room as it is should be affected. The next thing you might have missed here is that the picture itself never really gets damaged. As she's smashing at it, the frame is obliterated, including the glass, but the picture itself still looks fine. It should have been thrashed into little pieces, but that doesn't seem to happen. Although it does start to loop, like the film starts to loop here during this. So it might not be a big deal, but it's interesting all the same as far as I'm concerned. Another thing you might have missed that I'm not 100%, I wasn't able to test this or check this yet, but there did seem to be an emphasis on the sound that we hear with Sarah before she enters the room and grabs the picture. I couldn't put my finger on anything exactly, so it didn't stand out to me as anything that I remembered, but I've read a couple different people in a couple different places say that this is the sound of Sarah whenever she was wailing or moaning when she called Leland at the Great Northern in the original Season 1. So, like I said, I can't say that for sure. I did have an indication that there was something that we're supposed to pick up there, and that's the best thing I've read so far. Since we're talking about the Palmer house, the next thing you might have missed was what was showing on the fireman's screen. I mentioned it in my recap, but it's worth another mention if you missed that video. During the time that evil Coop is locked in the cage in the fireman's theater, we see the giant alter his path. So when Mr. C enters the vortex, he was likely expecting to end up at the Palmer house, where he was planning on finding Judy. We see the house on the screen, and the fireman swipes it across to change it from there to outside the Twin Peaks Sheriff's Department. And when evil Coop ends up there, he says out loud, "What is this?" So that leads me to believe that Judy is inside of or in control of Sarah Palmer, which I touched on in my Judy video. There was another thing here that I'll mention, but I don't know. I wasn't bowled over by it when I saw it. On Reddit, there's a post that someone made that whenever Jeffries shows that symbol, which was basically the owl cave symbol that breaks apart and turns into the 8. The Redditor posted that when it breaks apart, when it becomes the 8 from the owl cave symbol, it sort of turns into the number 708, which is the address on the Palmer household. The reason I wasn't 100% bowled over by it is because there's not much. First of all, there's two little pieces there. So one's a 7 and one's a backward 7. And the other thing is that there's really no other way that symbol could break in. You know what I mean? Like, it wasn't really manipulated anyway. It just literally breaks into pieces and then turns into an 8. Depending on the way you look at it, it could be interesting or it could just be a lucky coincidence. So that's up to you guys there. Another thing you might have missed here in this scene was that Phillip Jeffries says it's slippery in here. So it's kind of interesting to think that even though we've been calling him a kettle or a teapot or insert any other description you have for what it is that Phillip Jeffries is now, it may just be that he's inside there. So that's something to think about. The next thing is a callback that probably nobody missed, but if you haven't rewatched the original run recently, I think the context is interesting. When Mike meets Dale after he passes through the door in the basement of the Great Northern, he repeats a phrase we've heard before. He says, "Through the darkness of future past, the magician longs to see one chance out between two worlds, fire walk with me." Now, this came from Season 2, Episode 6, which was titled Demons. That was an episode that had a bunch of different developments, and we heard this for the first time when Philip Gerard's meds wear off, at which point he changes to the Lodge personality, Mike. Mike can't or won't say where Bob is actually from. When Coop asks him, though, Bob, he says, "What does Bob want?" Mike says that Bob is eager for fun, and to him, killing is fun. He wears a smile, and everybody run. He explains how Bob is sort of a parasite, and he is fueled by, or he's feeding on fear and pleasures, but that he needs a human host. He reminds Coop that he and Bob were together at one time, working together, and, they lived above a convenience store until Mike saw God, or the face of God. Says the poem. It's interesting because Coop actually says it along with him, and he explains about how he saved himself chopping off Philip Gerard's arm. And he lays out that he has one purpose, and that's to stop Bob. And then we also heard that phrase, "the gifted and the damned," whenever he talks about the face of Bob is only, his true face, I should say, is only seen by the gifted or the damned. So, yeah. And that ends the episode, after he tells them that for nearly 40 years, Bob's been nearby. And he describes a giant house made of wood with different rooms, but all alike and all inhabited by many different souls each night. The episode then goes to the ending, which is a shot of the Great Northern with a red light on it. And it's kind of striking when you think about it. This has been one of the most theorized phrases in the original run of Twin Peaks, right down to the actual wording. Like the word chance spelled CHANCE or CHANTS. And there's reasons why both answers seem to be right. So, and I don't want to go into that rabbit hole, but anyways, this could just be a whole nother video altogether. However, one of my favorite theories I've read of this in the past was that this saying comes, fire walk with me comes from a situation where you're trapped, but you have to make a deal with one of these entities or something like a demon, which is the name of the title, in order to get out. Did the return bringing this phrase back up bring any clarity, really? Not really. Not totally, but it does give us more to look at when we compare the two different times Mike has delivered the phrase in the future of our theorizing. The next thing you might have missed was it's 2:53. When Cooper looks at the clock after asking Diane if she remembers everything and she says yes, it's glitching between like 2:52 and 2:53. This little bit is fascinating for a bunch of different reasons, and there could be a whole separate video on that as well. But what I feel is essential to point out is this. When Frank, Hawk, and Bobby opened the tube for Major Briggs, they found the note that led them to Jack Rabbit's palace, and eventually got Andy in front of the fireman. The slip of paper had 2 dates with the time 2:53, which I initially figured meant that they would have to visit the same place on 2 different days. Instead, we see that the time of the second date referred directly to this moment. There was a piece of paper that had 2 Coopers, and we saw the end of Evil Cooper when his body was transferred to the Red Room after Dale put on the Alcave ring. Well, he put it on him, obviously. And we saw the return of Agent Dale Cooper to the town of Twin Peaks, which is emphasized by Diane saying, the one and only. So the majority of what was on that piece of paper has come to light at this point. The only parts that are really not exactly clear are the moon and the sun and the image of what we expect to be Judy above Blue Pine Mountain. So theorize away on that one. The next thing you might have missed is the wide shot of the characters of the return in the Twin Peaks Sheriff's Department. With all that happens in the sequence that happens in Frank's office, this doesn't really stand out at first. But take a moment to soak this in. Look at the characters. I mean, we have characters old and new, most of which have played a large role in all of these people and this lineup being here at this moment. If you had mixed feelings about the return, and especially the finale, take a long look at each one of these characters and try to think of what your favorite scene of theirs was this season. Think about the last scene they were in and how the earlier ones they were involved with got them exactly to that point. It's pretty interesting, and gosh, it's remarkable if you ask me. There was a post on Reddit where they sort of mentioned each one of them from left to right and described them, and it's just hilarious when you think about it. There was an entertaining amount of different interactions between all these people. The last thing I'm going to talk about today is one more trip into Jaldea territory. I made a whole video about this, so I won't go on too long about it, but there have been other theories that have popped up since, so I think it's safe to say that the meaning of the phrase Jaldea will continue to be a mystery for quite some time. When Gordon explains Judy to Albert and Tammy, he explains that the name came from what used to be called Jaldea in olden times. Most importantly, he describes it as an extreme negative force, and that's likely the best description we could hope for. What I mentioned in that video were there were 2 prevailing ideas that were going around, with the most popular by a lot being that Jaldea was translated from Chinese to mean to explain. If you change the spelling up a little bit, you get a translation that means to scream. So those are the 2. There's other ones that have popped up, which I don't really need to go all the way into. But what's somewhat hilarious about the explained definition is that if it's right, then we'll probably never know any more about it. Like, it just ends, the explanation ends here. While we might get some nuggets out of Mark Frost when the final dossier comes out in relation to the Blue Rose Task Force, Lynch himself already went pretty far to explain what Judy is, so expecting more information would be dreaming. So you guys can tell me in the comments what your favorite one is, or if you think it doesn't mean any of those things, that he just said that because it was funny and he had to make up something as a backstory for Judy. So there you have it, 10 things you might have missed. There were certainly more. These were the ones I think that I wanted to point out because they'll lead us into other discussion later. It was really action-packed. There was a lot of stuff that was resolved. And you gotta admit, it was pretty awesome to see that old footage where Josie just continues to get ready in the morning and Pete walks right down and starts to fish as if nothing's going on. And, it was a nice touch. I think the scene where Cooper and Diane kissed was really kind of great as well. Like, it was unexpected in so many different ways. A lot of people guessed that Diane might be Nido, but the reveal was very exciting because, all the theories that have existed, more often than not have turned out to be completely off base. So if you think about how long we wondered about who he was talking to in that tape recorder, and you go back through the season and realize that they weren't that close or they weren't close in that way before he disappeared. So that kiss and that question of, do you remember everything? I mean, that's related to something that's happened in his time away. He could have been visiting her in her dreams. He could have had other alternate timelines that ended different ways. You know what I mean? There's just a lot of different things that could actually make sense there. The amount of questions that it brings up is just amazing. We'll have to get into those into the future, but it's not really within the scope of this video. And, there's just so much to think about, so much to talk about. If you've only watched it once, I can tell you from my own experience that it kind of gets better every time you watch it. And I liked it a lot the first time I watched it. But once the big reveals are out of the way, once you know what's coming, you pick up on a lot more details, and it's just really fantastic. So we'll be watching this and rewatching this for years to come, I have a feeling. So one more of these tomorrow, and then we'll make some other stuff. But yeah, part 18 tomorrow, that's my plan. I got a book giveaway over on my Patreon account, so make sure you follow the link and go check that out. It's growing pretty well, so I want to thank those of you who signed up already. Now that the finale videos are winding up, we'll get into some more stuff and figure out where we're going to go. So yeah, but think about it, man. Think about coming over there and joining the community. And I would really appreciate it so that I can get a new mic and do all these things that I need to do in order to make the best Twin Peaks videos I can. Make sure you like this video if you enjoyed it. Make sure you subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Turn on notifications and make sure you follow me on my social media accounts. Twitter's where I'm at most of the time, but you can find me on Instagram and Facebook as well. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll talk to you soon.